fairly quickly. Um, I think 30 minutes will give us adequate time, since next week we'll be covering the very end of it. So if you have your books, you want to open them up to page 444. 444.
My dad doesn't buy me books.
No, your dad. I'm going to read through kind of the first part of it, and then I think what we'll do is we'll kind of move through a good portion of the teaching this week, talking about Greek influence now that is encroaching upon Egyptian culture, and kind of as this chapter says here, chapter 23, the long goodbye, and then next week we'll spend some time talking more about kind of the Roman, the finality of Roman rule. And so again, as we read through this, because we're covering a lot of ground, it seems fairly quickly, it's important to remember that the stuff that we cover is happening over hundreds of years. And so it is not always a really significant shift. And the reason I want to emphasize that is that as we've discussed, well, I'll ask you this question. What is the purpose, do you think, of our educational pursuits as far as history is concerned? Well, certainly, I think all of your educational pursuits. But what is the purpose here for this class? How would you perceive that?
Probably with the Bible study, not only learning about the Bible, with our relationship with Emmanuel, and with you and Noah as well, to be taught and under authority, and to learn about the past and how we can reflect and improve from that.
Okay. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Kayla. I think it also helps us to grow together as a people. There's a lot we can learn from history, because even if we learn about different cultures, we're all one human race as a people, and I think we can learn from how people did things and how humankind has ruled and made mistakes and good things that were decided, and but yeah, I think history is probably one of the most important subjects in school, because it kind of teaches us who we are, and but for more of our people here learning history, I definitely think it's more of a growing together and learning it through the eyes of how God worked throughout humanity. So.
Yeah, I agree with both of them. I also think that a big thing that I've taken, I guess, is the quality of learning how to learn, and the way that I take, these things, and my focus has grown, I think, and my enjoyment of it. I think, I've, in the past, just kind of seen history as something I have to do and I have to just have in my head, but I've learned to enjoy it more and put myself almost in a situation of gratitude to be able to know these things.
You don't have to share. It's not required for everyone.
You must share. Well,
See the panicked looks.
yeah, either on the headlights.
Well, good. I won't press you. That's encouraging. But really, the purpose of this class, history in particular, is a study of culture, sociology. It's not just merely facts and dates and times, although those are significant. It is a study of relationship, and the dynamic of relationships of people groups and various cultures and influences of cultures. But ultimately, history is about how God has moved on the earth. And that is true of all cultures, whether cultures recognize the one true God or not. Because all of us, right, we were created for a very distinct purpose. Ultimately, that is to worship God. And so some cultures, in their own struggles to try to understand things, have come up with ways that are not his ways. Some, not knowingly, have stumbled directly upon what he would say are good ways, and they just blindly doing. They're not doing it for the right reasons. They don't really have a comprehension of it, but they're doing good things or right things. And so what history affords us, properly understood, really is a view that becomes much larger than ourselves, which is really important. We all sit in the context of our personal history, certainly, but the world's history as a whole. I do want to commend you guys in one thing, and I'm not sure if you guys have recognized this, but I've intentionally had a different teaching style throughout this course, where much of the teaching has really been generated by each of you. And so I want to commend you, because I think that the questions that you're asking are really good questions. They're thoughtful. What it shows to me is that you're taking this seriously, and that you're making some level of effort to truly try to discern the information. It's important because the goal of any good teacher should not be merely just to give you information, but to teach you how you can learn. Because ultimately, you guys are responsible for what you learn and what you know, and most importantly, how you will live as a result of it. And so, as we discuss history here, I really want to make sure that we do keep at the forefront of our mind that history, understood from a Christian perspective as a son of God, is to interpret and discern and understand the spirit that is at work throughout that culture, in that person's life, whatever it may be. And to take the lessons that we are learning and then begin to have some introspection, asking ourselves questions, challenging ourselves to how that may.
I don't want to interrupt you, but
No, you're good.
question. So,
Sure.
now, what you at this point, before shifting Greek culture, what do you think the spirit or the things going on with the Egyptian culture?
Well, I think widely what we understand the Egyptian culture to be. I mean, it is truly was the world's first world power in its longevity. I mean, the sheer longevity of Egyptian culture means something of significance. I think the spirit is
3,000 years now. Around
thousands of years. I think it's the spirit of the world.
the spirit of the world.
And it really is it's a counterfeit kingdom. It's a world. I mean, and again, we started with this mindset that what was preeminent in Christian thought was the idea of divine kingship, which is a true spiritual truth.
Yeah.
There is divine kingship, but not in pharaohs, not in men who proclaim it of themselves, right? But there is one true God. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, right? And so we see that there is a form of truth that is presented by Egypt, but it is just that. It's a form. It's not the absolute truth, right? This is why in many ways the spirit of the world is such a counterfeit, right? And we've talked about this, that Satan himself disguises himself as an angel of light, right? An angel of light. Both positive imagery there. But what do we know to be true? Right? Again, Egypt is born out of the primary or central thought of it is chaos. And everything kind of submits to that chaos, right? And so as we've advanced now through kind of the ebbs and flows of really great leaders and very poor leaders, seeing fractured families, different dynasties take over. We've talked about monetary power and consolidating that. We've talked about militaristic power and how Egypt did really good at borrowing things from other cultures and kind of reinventing itself consistently. But the main theme through there is that, again, that whole idea of divine kingship, and what really propped Egypt up amongst many other places is really its strict adherence to its religious practices. And so again, what they've always leaned on is getting back to the very pure way that Egyptians saw life and living. And even though it was counterfeit in many ways, when we look at the longevity of Egypt, we see that the significance of why culture is so important. And culture, not just for the sake of having culture, because there's a lot of, we see that kind of in modern church certainly, but just modern culture in general. There's a lot of subcultures that develop. It's almost even in and of itself, you see with kind of the rise now over the last, it's not even been 10 years, of social media and how it's even created its own subcultures, right? So you've got, even within social media, you can follow different subcultures of things, or, you know, pursuits or likes or whatever, right? So it's really easy to fit in for the first time historically, to find somebody you fit in with. You don't even know. I mean, you could be an isolated person, but you could find somebody who has the same likes, interests, sense of humor, whatever. And on our phones, we can have a whole culture that is tailored to do what? To appeal to ourselves. And this is problematic from a cultural standpoint, because culture cannot be cultivated outside of the context of actual relationship. Culture has to be. It's predicated upon relationships. Yeah. This is why the pharaohs worked very, very diligently to present to the people a religious order that was palatable for them, but had themselves in relationship to the people that followed them as a god on earth, right? And so it was a good culture in the sense that there was a lot of unity there. It was a bad culture in the sense that the Pharaoh used fear as kind of the opera, and again, born out of chaos, control, yeah. Right? To keep the people at close to them. And so now we see here at the first chapter, I'm going to read through a little bit here. We see now Greek culture clashing against Egypt, but then kind of this weird thing that happens where we have different cultures that Greece kind of comes in, and instead of just trying to throw out the culture, it begins to try to blend in the culture and then slowly draw Egyptian culture into an assimilation of Greek culture. We see this in two primary ways. The first is really kind of seeing for the first time a Western view of the world, which is intellectualism. And so now all of a sudden it's not religion as a primary thing, but man's ability to ascend in their mind and to know things and to have power in that way. And then really with that came more finance and commerce. And so this would be much more strategic versus it just being, good crops, bad crops. But now it's about investments and how we manage money and where we move our monies and how we trade, strategically trade throughout the world. This is something that is much more of a Western ideal. And so we're really seeing through the death of Egypt and the rise of Greece, a really significant shift taking place historically. Is kind of the old way of doing things is replaced by this new pattern. And the problem is that we're culturally thinking of the world, not just our individual understanding of it. This creates a lot of unhealthy kind of things because we're kind of ridding ourselves of tradition in a sense that some traditions are good and valuable, and certainly religious tradition will be replaced here. And this is really important to note. Even though Egypt did not have a truly correct understanding of God, a pursuit of something that is moral or ethical as an ideal is now replaced with the religion of intellectualism. And so now we are kind of worshiping thought instead of, and thought as isolated, not personified, as in one thing, but in my abilities or my attempts to, I can become more wise or gain knowledge. And so it says here at the start, Alexander left Egypt in April 331, never to return. His stay had lasted barely 4 months. Yet, in that brief time, he had not merely added the land of the pharaohs to his growing list of conquests and had recognized himself as a living God. A little further down, Alexander recognized that although won by the sword, Egypt would not flourish under a military junta. So he ensured a clear separation of powers, leaving the military command in Macedonian hands while civil matters were entrusted to 2 governors, one Egyptian and one Persian. And so Alexander, best known as Alexander the Great, one of the first really cultures that dominated the world. And so he expanded his borders and really had control over primarily what we knew to be at that time, at least from Western thought, the bulk of the world. And so he was extremely intelligent in the way that he would fight, in the way that he would not just fight, but establish his kingdom's rule. Now again, thinking in terms of hundreds, if not thousands of miles away, it wasn't as quick as, jumping on a plane, flying 5 hours and putting down a rebellion. It meant that you had to have consolidated power and people who were faithful to human power. And so he begins to set up kind of this new order in Egypt where he honored a lot of the old ways of doing things. And he left some of the leaders in those areas in charge over certain matters. But he had a very clear, separate power now, which was militaristic. And so we kind of see this within our own understandings now of how government works. Remember what we talked about from our constitutional studies, that we are a constitutional republic that is made up of 3 branches of government. And so this is kind of, some of these things begin to be borne out in Greece, where Alexander has militaristic power and dominion there, but he's doing what? He's appeasing the Egyptians in a way that gives them a little bit of local control, a little bit of a local voice, and a little bit kind of keeping their culture intact. And so the way that this kind of mindset was called Hellenistic mindset would have been is that the best way to change culture is not to force culture. Now we saw that, did we not, with other different cultures, Libyans and things like that, where we would do things like use circumcision and things like that, where it would be kind of a forced cultural shift. We see now, historically, kind of a more subtle approach to shifting culture. Flipping over to now page 445, kind of right in the middle there, we see that Alexander passes away, and then what happens is there's kind of some infighting over who's going to take over for him, right? With not any real clear line of succession, and Ptolemy kind of comes to the top of the heap. It says Ptolemy might have held the reins of political and economic power, but he lacked the moral and spiritual authority that Alexander had possessed to reign over Egypt as Pharaoh. And so this now creates the first problem where we could see, does Egypt going to bounce back, or is Greek control going to be maintained? And that was really the question, because again, what Alexander had was a moral and spiritual authority. And why is that significant? Because the only way to truly take over a culture that is dominated with a religious center is for somebody, whether they fully had it or not, at least had it perceived a level of moral superiority. That there was something about the way that Alexander held himself and established himself in that really short 4 months that spoke to the Egyptian people in a way that they would have understood. And so he did a really good job, Alexander, of making himself like one of the pharaohs of old. They would have held him to that kind of vision in his sight. And so really critical.
Can I just
Sure,
add something
sure.
very interesting? I think would encourage that really. I know I noticed this. We just read the god Apis, am I? With the golden calf. Here's mentioned. When you started mentioning, I think, hey, is it going to talk about the Apis or not? So it is here in word it's talking about Apis. In the first paragraph of the whole chapter somewhere. Apis, the god, basically. There you go. As Alexander publicly displayed the pied the Apis bow, had been intended to emphasize, wanted to present himself as the liberator, Elijah ruler, respect all the Egyptian ancient tradition beliefs. Oh my, that's interesting, huh?
Mhm.
With the good calf, with said
Oh yeah.
mentioned of the picture of the Apis. So can you believe that? So that's the was ready yesterday morning. So yeah.
Hmm.
Anyway.
Yeah, and so we see that Alexander shows up,
Uh-huh.
liberator. He now becomes like a pharaoh, recognized as a living god.
Yeah.
He passes on Ptolemy now, where we'll get this whole line of secession from the Ptolemaic reign or dynasty within Egypt itself. And so we see what a secession of Ptolemy does. Ptolemy the first, Ptolemy the second, is they really begin to promote trade as being a very important part of the cultural understanding now. Whereas it would have been just consolidation of power, they're really trying to bring this new way of thought, more Hellenistic Greek way of thought of now, how do we gain power? Well, we can do that by commerce, by trading our goods. And so what's funny is that it's not just as, I guess not funny, it's not as simple as just, we're going to give you this good for that good. Some of it is militaristic. We'll just go and take over your mines. But then we'll take over those mines, and then we'll use the gold from that mine to maybe trade from places further away that we don't have control of yet. And so there's a strategy to how the Greeks took over the world. It was never this idea of world domination for the sake of world domination. That was the end goal. But they understood how to establish a culture within a people group and how to slowly assimilate those people into their way of thinking. In fact, we see this play itself out historically again and again and again. That the primary way to change a culture, well, let me ask you. What do you think the primary way, the best way, born out from history, is to change a culture?
Change its religion.
Change its religion?
Change the heart of the people.
Change the heart of the people? Those would be true, but how?
Change the governing philosophy, whatever. So.
Change the philosophy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
Let's turn to page 449.
449. That's tricky.
The very thing that we are doing here
Mm.
is how you change a culture. It's education.
Education, that's right.
Education.
Mm-hmm.
I think the way this has played itself out in American culture more recently is within the last 60 years, we have removed prayer from the school. Once prayer was removed from the school, teaching any kind of, like this kind of teaching, us even mentioning the Bible, strictly outlawed.
Yeah.
Within school. There's this faulty understanding of separation of church and state. We talked about that. But what do we see now in the generations of schools and teachers is a very liberal mindset where God is not a conversation. Morality is an important. Truth is a matter not of fact, but of whatever you feel like it is, right? Have you guys ever heard this? Like, that's your version of truth. Well, I'm going to tell you my truth. Well, there's no such thing as Justin's truth. There is the truth. The truth is absolute. Well, this all again comes back to this idea of education. How do I help or undermine a culture? Well, it's through education. And you certainly have to be charismatic. You have to have some level of power. To do it from a religious standpoint is always the best, but it's not easy to just come in and switch a religion, right? And we see that even through the Greeks. Like the Greeks didn't seek to say, okay, your religion, Egyptian religion is bad, we're tearing that down. In fact, a couple of times where they tried to include more Hellenistic understanding of gods and kind of like put them in with Egyptian things, they got a lot of pushback for that. And so that didn't really work. But we see here in the top of 449, it says, no institution better demonstrated the Ptolemies' vision for Alexandria than the Great Library. Ptolemy the First had been determined from the outset to steal Athens' crown and promote this his capital in the paramount intellectual center of the Greek world. To this end, he established a scholarly academy within the palace quarter presided over by a priest of the Muses.
What is music?
So yeah, we're going to talk about that. It's a
okay.
great question. But let's analyze this first. A priest. Now this is a very intentional position, right? When you think of priest, what do you think of? Somebody from a religious background. But the Muses were. So when you think of the word inspiration, that would be something that is very much in the what the Muses were. Yeah, the Muses were women. Originally, I believe it was 3, then branched out to 9 within Greek thought that were the inspiration. And these are their 3 primary things: literature, science, and the arts.
Oh yeah.
And so a muse was somebody, right, that would be what inspires you. So when we say, like, I'm amused by that,
Wow.
I'm drawn in by that. But see,
Wow.
the Muses were, again, they were not like gods themselves, but they represented like art and beauty and nature and history and song. There was like even muses of like harmony, and so it was. What's that?
Culture.
Yeah, it was a different cultural thing. Like when we think about like worship, like really getting caught up in worship. The Greek, if a Greek person, a Hellenistic Greek person were around you and saw you worshiping, they might think that you were under the influence of the muse.
Wow.
And so there is kind of, again, this now intellectual, emotional, experiential way of living that is now promoted. But notice it is a priest. So now we are beginning to see worship at what? The altar of intellectualism. We're worshiping at the altar of emotion. We're worshiping now at the altar of thought.
Human
Passions, yes. And so is Greek culture really that different from Egypt? Not a whole lot. Kind of the way it's given to the people is shifting a little bit. Now, we don't want to miss this, because what we know to be true at the heart of culture is there's a spirit of this world, the spirit of the Antichrist, the spirit of this age that is working against what? The Spirit of God.
Think about the Hollywood, everything spring forward,
Yeah.
amusement, right?
Yes.
Inspiration, art, in the name of people's intellectual entertainment, but actually totally change the cultural center in a sense. Yeah.
Right, because think about these things. Literature, where does literature, like writing, that comes from where? From God.
Yeah.
God, Jesus, in the beginning was the Word.
Yeah.
Right? So we understand that, but now pursuing literature just for the sake of itself. Right? And then here's the danger of worshiping books.
Yeah.
Worshiping things, right? And we have groups of people that become enamored with them just for the sake of themselves and not what the book represents. Because what good literature does, and we'll actually talk about this in our next class on Tolstoy, what good literature does is, again, it informs us of a great many things. It teaches us, it educates us. But if we pursue literature only for the sake of, our own self-gratification, there's danger in that. Science is really important, right? Like understanding the world and the absolutes of this world and how things are made, like how the human eye is created, or how a plant uses photosynthesis. All of those things do what? They tell us of the greatness of God. And yet, if we divorce ourselves from that and we simply look at whatever, botany or human anatomy or whatever, for the sake of itself, we don't arrive at the place that we were intended to arrive at. And then lastly, the arts. I'm pretty sure you guys like music, right? Or have you ever seen something, a painting or whatever, beautiful, that it moves you, right? There's various forms, or watch a movie or a short clip on something, right? And have an emotional response. all of those things would from a Greek perspective kind of bear out this thought of the muses. And so this is really now this mindset of Greek intellectualism begins to prop itself up by the library, this great library, which kind of stands for education. It was actually the largest, still widely recognized as probably, the belief is that it was the biggest library that ever historically,
Alexandria.
outside of the internet. Now the internet could rival it, right?
Yeah.
Right, if we looked at it from that. But think about it. Like in ancient times, it was the equivalent to somebody having an iPhone and having access to information.
Oh, yeah.
For somebody back then to have the understanding and the ability to learn it. And so it continues. It says, the museum swiftly became a powerhouse of research and teaching as the Ptolemies sought out the best brains from across the Greek world and lured them to Alexandria with the promise of academic freedom and a guaranteed salary. And so this is really clever. You have the freedom to come here and to teach whatever it is in your field of expertise, and we will not infringe upon it. That's giving a bunch of great liberty. Let me ask you, do you think that we should invite in any Bible teacher for a Tuesday meeting? No, that can create problems, correct? Mm-hmm. But if our goal on Tuesday was just merely to gather as a people so that we could appeal to our intellect, that would make sense, right? To have the world's best mind on the book of Genesis and bring them in. But see, it's a different way of understanding and being educated and perceiving things. The museum buildings had all the necessary elements of a scholarly community, covered arcades with recesses and seats for quiet contemplation, a large dining hall in which the learned members could meet to discuss ideas, and they would usually do so by drinking wine and having all sorts of food and pleasing the senses. And of course, a library. Not just any library, but the greatest collection of books in the ancient world, acquired by fair means or foul from the best book markets of the day. Ptolemy III was so desperate to acquire original editions of Greek literature classics that he even resorted to outright theft.
Wow.
His ruse was to borrow books from the libraries of Athens in return for a hefty deposit of 15 silver talents. As soon as the manuscripts had arrived safely in Alexandria, Ptolemy sent his thanks to the Athenians. They could keep the deposit. He was keeping the books. And so there's, again, and it continues here, as you read it, like pretty significant and major historical figures around that time that knew things about geometry and anatomy, and all of these things were gathered in one place. And so
What writer before Christ, there was a wonderful scholar of the Bible. What is his name? He's from Alexandria. He wrote a lot of books. How he influenced the Christian tradition.
Oh,
Paul. Anyway, don't worry
Yeah.
about it. Yeah, so, yeah.
and so we see, I mean, in fact, there's many church historians kind of coming out of Alexandria and those areas in Egypt. And so we see kind of now this altar, if you will, of intellectualism truly being formed. Now it doesn't overnight shift the culture. We'll see hundreds of years, right, of the Ptolemaic rule within Egypt kind of take control. And again, what happens, the ebbs and flows of sons and lineage and questioning and infighting and all of those things kind of play itself out. And we see this other world power is kind of behind the scenes lurking in wait. And is slowly beginning to rise up in Italy, in this Latin country that's kind of staying hidden. And so we see for the next couple hundred years, the country kind of taking shape in a different way, where again, we don't have just the pharaohs, but we have certainly authoritarians, Greeks, who are now here trying to maintain some level of religion. But there is this balancing act that begins to take shape between the Hellenistic understanding of the Greeks and the old ways of the pharaohs. And so what happens within Greek control for the first time in Egyptian history is there's a fracturing away of divine kingship as understood by one pharaoh to now seeing two different distinct cultures at play.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
I was thinking, I don't know, it doesn't make much context, but I want to notice this. I think it's worth it. It said it's in the last part of that section says there was a great tower built from the block stone within average whatever. But at the summit top of gigantic stature for, no, notice that guy? Zeus.
Mm-hmm.
And Jupiter. That's Jupiter.
Mm-hmm.
The crowning glory, became burned in the night. I was just thinking about today's day, the moon, the Jupiter actually come back again, brothers. I just shared last
Oh,
time.
yeah.
So,
We see symbology now of Hellenistic Greek culture.
Yes.
Zeus.
I was trying
Yeah.
to identify the Jupiter represents the Greek, the sons of Greece, the
Mhm.
gods of Greece.
Mhm.
It's a crazy thinking about it, you know. So, wow, song design coming.
Yeah, right.
Right? So, seriously, that's a crazy. Oh wow. Anyway, go ahead.
And so we see, Hellenistic kingship. This idea of kings from a Western way of thinking, and pharaohs, which would have been a more mystic or old
Eastern
way of thinking.
Yeah. Mm.
And we see now for the next couple hundred years, there's kind of this infighting of the old ways and people not really being convinced, but there's an influx of foreigners, Hellenistic Greeks that are coming in. There's an establishment of Alexandria and multiple other cities. And they established these cities near, like Thebes and all of these other places. And this was strategic, right? Because it put a militaristic power there. But more than just a militaristic power, how are they trying to undermine this old culture? By education, by informing them of new ways and introducing like commerce and all of these kind of new ideas. Now, it didn't change life a whole lot necessarily for the Egyptians who worked in the fields. It didn't really impact them as much, other than the fact that it began to cause them to rise up, to fight against, and then to slowly have to assimilate. And so again, we have a ruling power that's external. We have a ruling power external from themselves that is now slowly influencing.
Mm.
The problem with the Greeks were that you can only sustain a culture by having a very linear set plan. And although Alexander certainly had that, and some of the Ptolemies, because there was 12 of them, 13 of them, 14 of them, right? They kept coming. What happened is that individual men began to try to consolidate their own power, right? And we see that kind of infighting between brothers, and all of a sudden we have 3 different Ptolemies that are ruling, and then one of their moms was ruling for a while, and he didn't want his son to overtake him, and so he got his son sent to him, and he killed his son right in front of him.
Seriously?
And so we have all of this.
Fight.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's not any mistake that this happens with the backdrop of the way that the Greeks understood the Muses. They also had things called the Fates, right? And so there was this idea of Fates. Fates,
Okay.
yeah. And so there was this kind of understanding that we could take control of our own lives and kind of chart the course of our own destiny. And so this would have made sense, right? That if I was the king and I have 4 boys, and I think, well, one of them's looking at me kind of like they want to take over, just get rid of them.
Oh.
And that would have been really
I
common.
think it's common in the Greek gods.
Yes.
Right? So,
Yeah. It's very common
Yeah.
within Greek understanding to just annihilate them. Well, the problem is that brings chaos and disorder. Now understand, again, this is a spirit that is at work. It's manifesting itself because at the heart of Egypt is the spirit of chaos going through it. This is why we see rise and fall and rise and fall and ebb and flow and destruction and mayhem, and then peace and tranquility, but not really peace and tranquility because it dips and lulls again as well. And so we see kind of some of the infighting that takes place. Civil war comes in. Taxes are created with the problems, and we get towards. And I think we need to close up here. Towards the end here.
The Tim and Rich are gonna bring lunch to us.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're here.
Oh, you know.
Yeah.
You already here?
Yeah, so
let's
let's just finish up with
Okay.
this.
Okay.
There came a very historical time when there was this person, and we'll read at the very end of chapter 23, and we'll finish up 24 next week, where it says 464. Of mixed ancestry, Ptolemy the XII's baby daughter carried on her tiny shoulders the hopes and expectations of her diverse countrymen. Her life would be devoted to maintaining their independence. Her death would signal the end of pharaonic Egypt. Her name was Cleopatra. Cleopatra. And if you've studied any kind of history, you might have some context of who she was. But Cleopatra will be the gateway,
Antony.
the person who is the clear historical line in the sand of Egypt ending completely and Roman authority on earth coming in. And we see again, not something new, but it's the very same spirit of the world. It's just been repackaged in a more intellectual packaging.
Intellectual.
Yes. And so we will leave that there, and we'll pick up with questions and everything next week.
Thank you, Justin.
Yeah.
Thank you. Wow, that's interesting.